I'm going to introduce myself first because I'm the moderator. I'm sitting here because it was just more fun to be among the group. My name is Nadine Krefetz, and I'm a contributing editor at Streaming Media Magazine, and I'm also a consultant. Michael.
Hello, I'm Michael. I'm with Crunchyroll Ellation. I run a lot of the engineering groups there, and happy to talk a little bit about server-side ad insertion today.
Stephen Gray at Disney, working on the FX and Nat Geo platforms, doing ad tech.
Robert Jameson from WarnerMedia, primarily support the Turner side of the house, so all the Turner properties.
Okay, so one of the things is that question was a deep question. Before we get to that question, because I don't want to scare the people in the audience who may not have as much background on that, I wanted to say a couple of things about what this is about. So, but we'll get back to you. And if I actually don't get back to you yet, make sure you let me know again. So is there any other questions that are a little bit shorter or not quite into deep diving yet into this topic in terms of what you need to know about server-side ad insertion? Ah, yes.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious how you deal with ad deepening.
Okay, we are going to talk about that one. It's a good one. Okay. In fact, this is what we'll do is I'm trying to make this interactive, and I want to make sure we're targeted. So I'm going to get a couple of questions here. We won't get to them yet, but we will get to them. Essentially, today's panel, Harnessing SSAI Superpower. I'm actually known as server-side ad insertion girl in my other life, and that's why we've called this panel this. So, any other questions, just so that we can kind of get the targeting focused in the room? Okay. All right. Yes?
Troubles with SSAI with live streaming.
Okay.
Thoughts around that, how to avoid those, what to look out for.
Cool. Okay. Excellent. I think we've actually got these questions down, so that's really good. Anybody else? Okay, so now we'll go back to it. Oh, yes? Yes.
Maybe one, as you're going through this, maybe any key trending on the U.S. marketplace versus international marketplace.
Okay, U.S. versus, okay. All right, great. So we're going to start. Cool, we introduced everybody. So one of the first things is why SSAI? People have told me it's a way to ensure that content gets to their audience. So when I mean content, I mean ads. Server-side ad insertion, embedding the ad on the server side, essentially making sure that ad blockers aren't taking out the ad. Another part of server-side ad insertion, from a business perspective, a little bit more standardized in terms of you're not doing the development on a lot of the client platforms. What am I missing?
The performance as well.
Performance, okay. Performance, we call it the better user experience. Okay, the better user experience. So we've got three things. That's kind of the key focus as to why SSAI is important. Let me take a look at the questions here, and we can start off by chatting with the specialists here in the audience. Okay, so tell you what, first let's go through the workflow in a brief way. So I think, Stephen, you were going to talk about how the workflow is structured. What does it look like?
Yeah, so for client side, you have the client app or site. The SDK handles all the ad calls, beaking, and everything. That's kind of it. You know, the client makes with the SDK makes a call to the ad server, gets all the information back, plays the ads, all the beacons, so forth. On server side, now you've got the client app needs to call out to the server-side ad insertion service, but needs to pass a bunch of information to that service, because that service then makes the call to the ad server to get the ads back. Likely needs to transcode those ads to make sure they're all formatted correctly, and then handles beaconing, usually on the server side, but passes back that video stream back to the player, and needs to do all of that in concert.
Okay, that's a good introduction to it. What and why beaconing?
So I mean, beaconing is goes hand in hand with measurement of the ad playback. So the VAST document itself, which is sort of the interchange format that we use to supply ad inventory to services, represents different beacons. You've watched 25% of the ad, you've watched 50% of the ad, you've pressed the skip ad button, and so forth. Each of these actions or events within the ad playback experience result in will have a URL associated with them that through the process of beaconing that URL, you're communicating to the ad server sort of the experience the user is having during your ad playback.
Doesn't it also have something to do with getting paid?
Yes, of course. So once once they look at the summary of these beacons and make a determination whether the user watched the ad in completeness, and there's additional sort of viewer heuristics that are defined in later VAST specifications beyond sort of just the basic event model of where you are in the ad stream.
Okay, so we've got the beaconing. We've got a little bit of the workflow outlined. Why a manifest? Why is it manipulated? And this is actually directed to anybody who wants to answer it, but perhaps we should go to you since you haven't talked.
Okay, sure. So in a server-side ad insertion scenario, you're moving most of the logic and the ad calls and all the other stuff to the server, right? So the server is making ad calls on the client's behalf, and then manipulating that manifest, essentially stitching the ads into the manifest, which the client will just consume the manifest, and it's not as concerned, or it doesn't have to be concerned about making the ad calls or doing anything else.
Okay. Okay. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
Sure. I mean, I think moving this logic to the server has, as we outlined in the beginning, has some advantages, and that stream manipulation, can easily be implemented once as opposed to many times per all the client playback contexts. It also potentially facilitates syndication. So if you're doing a live stream that gets syndicated into another application context, you still could have dynamic ad insertions in that stream. So it sort of is able to put you a little closer to the decisioning without a lot of integration complexity.
Okay, so theoretically that means we're saving on engineering resources, right? At a certain point.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly a lot easier to support, pointing a player at a HLS or Dash stream than it is to do a lot of client-side integration. Though, if you go back to sort of the beaconing question, modern server-side ad insertion solutions often include a client-side SDK, and many ad networks prefer that you beacon from the client or minimally beacon from the client through the SSAI beacon proxy. So even still that we've started to move to SSAI, we come back a little bit to per client integrations around the requirements for measurement.
Okay, so let's go into that a little bit more. So if you need to do client work, or if you need to do specific beaconing, why are you doing that? Anybody?
You're asking why would you still do server-side ad insertion if you ultimately have to integrate a server-side ad insertion SDK?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, do you guys want to answer that one? I can answer it too, but yeah. I mean, because of the aforementioned reasons, right? The performance is much better. Mm-hmm. Like many of the living room platforms, you can't have two video streams buffered at the same time in memory. You're dealing with constrained devices like a Chromecast or
two video streams, two players.
Like for instance, you can't pause the video. Like in web, for instance, you pause the video, load another video tag, put it on top, play the ad, remove that DOM element, and now start to resume playback of the video. But in living room environment, many clients don't have that capability of maintaining two video stream buffers, for example. Mm-hmm. So then you have a big performance hits of trying to like seek back to where you left off and so forth.
Right. Now, actually, right before I'm going to continue this, how many people in this room are engineers and actually already work with advertising technology? Okay, all the people in the back. Are you afraid of us? Okay, all right, just so I know.
So other reasons to still use SSAI, even though you might still have to implement all the beaconing client side, you still get that benefit of the better user experience, ad blocking. I mean, you still get the ads going through. Questionable whether the ad blockers are going to block the impression beacons, but that's still, you're going to deal with that either way. So but you still get the better user experience.
I think it's more control too. I mean, it goes
yeah.
back to user experience in the end, right? Like a lot of these
Yeah.
things come back to user experience, but they're manifestations. Like VPaid, if anybody's worked with VPaid a lot, you know that it can be pretty painful to debug various VPaid creatives that come in through programmatic fulfillment, where it's sort of this open network of executable code that's like trying to run within your browser, which for unsurprisingly doesn't always work super well.
Okay, so wait, you're jumping ahead of yourself.
No,
that's
no.
okay.
I was going to say like sometimes you don't really have a choice, right? You know, and some of it's probably historical. I guess the easiest example of that is Roku, right? If you're doing mid-roll ads and conditioned content, like you don't really have a choice. You have to do server-side ad insertion, and then you also don't have a choice. You have to do client-side beaconing through their ad framework. And it's somewhat historical as well. I mean, I think back to some of our first implementations. It was on some of these devices that may not have SDK support, you know, long ago, right? And it was easy and easier in these, you know, walled gardens to crank out SSAI solutions, do server-side beaconing. But then there's this sort of pullback, I think, from advertisers, right, where all of a sudden or not all of a sudden, but you know, everybody wants client-side beaconing for, you know, measurement purposes, and it has to come from the client, right? And so you've seen sort of people pull back and go into client-side beaconing to address those, just simply because there's going to be more revenue there.
I would add, in another example where you don't have a choice, of course, is live streaming itself, right? Like if you're having a live event, you can't sort of just depend on the client to load, you know, to have arbitrary amount of time to fulfill an ad request and play it, and then go back to the live content with fluidity that is people are accustomed to in a broadcast experience.
Okay. So you mentioned something earlier, and I just want to make sure that this was clear. So one of the things that happens is you're not having an ad blocker, but you have somebody blocking the beacon measurement. Is that right? Or the beacon, or recording the beacon?
Yeah, so the ad still plays because it's stitched into the stream, because unless you're blocking the content, because the ad blocker gets blocking the content.
Right.
But the ad blocker itself is blocking certain domains, and if those domains are tied to the impression pixels or any of the trackers, those are getting blocked.
Okay.
So that would be why that would be.
Okay, so that's a bad thing. So essentially, you've got the content, you've got the ad, and then you have to beacon. And the beacon, when it gets lost, you don't get paid.
Yeah, I mean, but inherently with deploying a SSAI solution, you're sitting in between that manifest request, and that provides you some, you know, the mechanism to address that, because you can essentially rewrite the beacons to a domain that's within your control and so forth.
Right, okay.
Pixel proxy, essentially what we call it, right? You essentially bounce every pixel off of the stitcher, and then that way you ensure that your beacons make it.
Okay, hey, what about Stitcher's personalization? So what happens? Are we actually going and personalizing the ad environment for each person who looks at this content?
I certainly hope so. Yeah, I mean,
Hope so. Okay.
I don't know about everybody's solution, but you know, certainly ours does.
Okay.
I mean, we call that being one-to-one, right? I
Right.
mean, for every viewer watching, you have a distinct manifest with distinct ad calls, and you get whatever ads came back in your specific ad request.
So, I mean, that's the scale issue, isn't it? Making sure that you can target one-to-one.
Yes, and that goes to, yes, most providers should be able to scale to the size of events that you're doing, especially in live sports, because everyone gets that ad request at the same time.
Yeah.
And so that's where scale definitely needs to be considered, and making sure you choose a partner that can handle that.
So in fact, before we go further into this, so what are the questions you should be asking your vendor about scale?
I just need to make sure that, well, so
If they're not asking you that question, then that's certainly not a good vendor.
what's that?
I mean, if that vendor doesn't ask you how much.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the big things is the definitely making sure that they have the bandwidth to handle whatever the size event you have, and that's probably the biggest one, especially if you're dealing with like a Super Bowl, World Cup, where you get some of these games that get just large numbers, and you want to make sure that the server side, the SSAI provider is not going to choke, but then you also need to make sure that any kind of CDNs related to that are also handling that. Other parts of the other questions you should be asking your SSAI providers, just what kind of tools they have around logging, debugging, and insights into the ad requests and beacons that are being made on your behalf, just so you can have real insight to see what's actually being done. So in case, or at least for me, having to go back doing a lot of troubleshooting, want to make sure that the tools are there to be able to get at the information that's being passed.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I was going to say that, yeah, the scale issue, right? One of the things you mentioned is just think about every sort of third-party vendor that's connected to, you know, your implementation, right? So you have a first-party viewability vendor that gets hit constantly, right? And you're operating at scale, and they might fall over, right? You know, or causing other sort of, you know, smaller sort of third-party ad providers to fall over. I've seen it happen personally, right? So yeah, even if your ad server's good, which, you know, you're using DFP or FreeWheel or something, they're not going to fall over, and, you know, you certainly hope your Stitcher's not going to fall over at Super Bowl level scale. Yeah, there's a lot of other smaller players that may not be expecting that amount of traffic and the influx of that many users.
Okay, so scale, absolutely.
I think there's sort of dimensionality to the scale in the context of SSAI. So, for instance, if you're if you're doing programmatic fill versus direct sales, that has hugely different implications towards the amount of sort of transcoding infrastructure that has to be associated with your SSAI deployment. So it's also an important consideration.
Yeah, that's something that I think is pretty important, actually. The ability to do sort of real-time ad encoding, because, okay, so number one, not everybody's going to give you an HLSTS asset if that's what you have, right? And frankly, I don't trust anyone else, right? I don't want to put the user experience of my users in someone else's hands, someone else's ad encode, right? Which, you know, could be broken or messed up, right? So a lot of people will say, give me the MP4, I'll transcode it myself. And you know, it gets, again, a little dicey, would say, some of the programmatic stuff, but at least for direct sold stuff and stuff you know is going to be coming down, you can prime that, right, with your ad transcoding service.
Okay, I'm going to touch on that in a second. This is a commercial for these men here. So you guys have been doing SSAI for different amounts of time, so why don't we just go down the table and we can actually get a little bit more background on you guys and tell me when you've been, or how long you've been doing it, so, and what you're using it for.
I guess I first got into it, I don't know, 6-7 years ago, something like that. So before I was on the video players and services team, I was an ad tech guy. So I did the initial rollouts of our simulcast on all of the Turner networks. At first, that was client-side stitching, and then once we sort of got that out and stabilized, we moved on to some server-side ad insertion on some of the connected devices. Primarily, I guess the first ones we probably did were CNN and NBA. Were probably the first two that we launched, and you know, those were sort of very basic implementations, server-side beaconing and like that.
Okay, we need context, and you can't skip this part of it.
Yeah,
You, so.
probably about 4 years with SSAI. little bit at first, and then eventually we moved all our platforms over to SSAI, and then now.
Which particular well-known events were you using SSAI for?
Well, we used big ones would be Super Bowl
Super Bowl.
51, and then the Men's World Cup, and then I was also helping out the team with the Women's World Cup last year.
Okay, so you've got some scale.
Yeah, those are much larger. The concurrency considerations are massive at that scale.
And you?
Yeah, so I mean, I historically worked with SSAI at Kaltura, which was the OVP platform I was working with prior to joining Ellation. Here at Ellation Crunchyroll, we were just now starting to roll it out as of present. So we're looking at rolling it out across all of our 15 million or so AVOD users per month.
Okay, and you're not really live, are you? It's more.
Yeah, it's in dark mode at the moment.
Okay. No, what I meant is the content. Do you have any live streaming content?
No, yeah, we don't do live streaming very much.
Okay, so as you can see, different use cases here, and now back to our regularly scheduled programming. So we were talking about encoding the ads, and so just for everyone here who's not totally into what the latest stuff is, so what happens with the ads? So you know you need an ad break, right? Then what happens?
Yeah, so you hit the ad break. Obviously, all the calls to the ad server, ad comes back. With server side, I don't know any of the providers that don't do this, but they all transcode the creative to match whatever their flavor is of the stream, and so they want to make sure that everything is all aligned. It helps for stability of the system, so it's totally understood. So going back to that, so yeah, basically every ad gets transcoded by the provider to match the flavor that they're using.
So like 4K and down, and down.
And down, yeah.
And down.
It all depends on the provider and what the stream, basically whatever the content stream is, they want to match the ad creatives to that.
So that there's no discernible difference, right, when the ad gets stitched in.
Yeah, and sadly, it's not like magical, right? So what's going to happen is you're going to have like the first person that comes along to get this particular ad.
Right.
It's not in the Stitcher's cache, right? So you're going to have a cache miss, and then it sends off that job for transcoding, and then a couple minutes later, that ad will get transcoded, and the next person that comes along and gets that ad, you'll be okay, and you'll get it. That's why I was sort of talking about like priming, and in sort of high-profile, high-scale events, we'll typically prime the cache of the Stitcher in advance to make sure any important sponsors are going to be on there, and no one misses that partner's ads.
Do you consider prime and preloading the same thing?
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I think we've done slightly. I mean, we have to get the assets transcoded. An area that we're trying to sort out at the moment is around kind of, not necessarily having the same flavor set across our whole catalog. We have quite a large catalog of content that we work with, and a very long tail of that. And so when we look at doing encoding optimizations, we want to sort of run them on subsets of content. And so we have to kind of, manage that mapping so that you get the same flavor set that you've configured for your ads for your AVOD users, if that makes sense.
It does to me.
yeah.
But now, in fact, let's take a little bit of a check-in here. So in terms of questions that people have so far, we're kind of stepping through everything that we've talked about. Does anyone have a particular question, just so that I can make sure? Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned the first time somebody calls for a particular ad, it takes a couple minutes.
Right.
So what do you do with that user in the meantime? Do you give them something else?
Okay, so the question then is, so if the first time the ad is called, the ad does not get delivered to the user, what happens?
So it depends on the provider or the service that you're using. Some will have a fallback ad that was already pre-transcoded, like they have a subset of backfill to use. Others, it just skips over, and then you get 30 seconds of slate or whatever on the back end of the break. It depends on the provider. Some have solutions for it, some don't. I guess that's another kind of question to ask your service provider.
Yeah, you can think about it in terms of like client-side ad fulfillment and how normally you're sort of exercising a bit of a waterfall, and you try to ask for ads, and if that for any reason an ad can come back as as an error, or it can be it didn't bid high enough to win out and towards being displayed to the user. So there's sort of mechanisms in place within the ecosystem to sort of fail over to more common ads, or house ads as we call them. Like at the end of the day, you'll get kind of an ad for the service itself, which has certainly already been pre-ingested because it's sort of a house ad.
Okay, so in fact, there was two different directions I was going to take this in, but since I can't do two things at once, we'll go for scale. So what happens when you briefly touched on it? So if you've got a huge event going on, right, and you want to make sure the ads go out, and you want to make sure that they go and they're not perceived as fraud, what happens there? So one, we want to have the content. Two, we want to make sure it's recorded. Do you need more around that, or can you talk?
Well, I think in terms of the, you work with your SSAI provider to make sure that you pre-transcode everything ahead of time, and that which generally means there's less opportunity to have programmatic come in there because you don't know what's going to be there. So
Right.
On these larger events, it's all site served first party ads that we've put in there.
Yeah, and I would say even with third-party stuff, you have more likelihood to get accused of fraud, right? So I've had vendors come back to me and say, hey, all this traffic was not valid. It was all coming from AWS. And you're like, that's because it's our Stitcher. So what do I need to do to make you happy? And usually it's something like, some sort of whitelist or headers they want passed or something of that nature. But it just sort of happens, and we end up, I think, just sort of being reactive to it, right? It's difficult to be proactive to that because you never know where, this third-party ad's going to come from.
But that's definitely something to plan for, right? So that in order for you to get
Sure.
the attribution.
But on something on the scale like he's working on with the Super Bowl, I mean, you're not going to leave that to chance. It's all going to be first-party stuff, right?
Right.
I mean, we don't.
Yeah.
I totally get it, right? A lot of the high-scale stuff that we've done in the past, we'd do the exact same thing.
Now, and the only reason I'm following up on this is because I try to kind of continually follow the trend. So last time I think I had your colleague, Joe, on the panel, he said that there was a certain amount of recording the content as fraud. So in that, it wasn't actually tracked as deliverable content. But I'm sure you fixed it now.
Yeah, that was something we ran into with because we're dealing with beacons at scale that we found that during the World Cup on some larger games, we were losing beacons at the edge, and so we had a pretty large discrepancy that came through, and it was just like, well, here's the audience as we saw it. This is what the actual impressions came in as. Why? And we spent months trying to track that down, and seemed the likely cause at the end of it all was just sheer number of beacons at the edge getting lost because of the large scale of just everything hitting at once.
So in terms of what you're going to ask your vendor about, what's the thing that how do you phrase it?
I just want to try to get what kind of assurances they have and just the concurrence that they can handle at the edge of getting hit all at once. Because a lot of times with the CDNs, they're not used to everything coming at once. It's all trickled in and it's all asynchronous. But when you have everything coming in,
Burst.
and it just bursts. There you go. That bursts. It's.
Right.
I would also be super careful with how your Stitcher is processing beacons. We've seen particular vendor, batch and then fire beacons, and that can be potentially bad news if you have things like user experience or frequency caps on your ads. And so we've had some high maintenance advertisers that have come through and said, we only want this to appear, once every X minute per user. And if you're rolling through a playlist full of clips, right, the beacons for the previous ad may not have been fired by the stitcher before the next opportunity comes up, and so you could get stuck in this loop where you're seeing the same ad over and over again. So firing the beacons in real time, or as close to real time as you possibly can, is pretty key. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself having issues with the ad server.
Okay, all right. So, and then the other question, the other direction I was going to go into. So I think you were talking waterfall, VPaid, VAST. Do you want to go into that?
Sure. So when we were dealing with primarily VOD in the case of Crunchyroll content, and in this case we're sort of asking the ad network for a VMAP, which is just sort of another sort of IAB standard around representation of multiple VAST documents across time of a video stream. And so that owns kind of the map that we use to then insert the ads within the stream. And certainly within that map, there's various VAST calls that get made, and then those get resolved towards what is ultimately displayed to the user relative to both the availability of the asset being transcoded and the winning out of that ad partner's fill for that user.
So I want to interrupt you for 1 second here. So VPaid, older format.
Well, VPaid has continued to evolve, and it has a new. I mean, they've continued to release newer versions of VPaid, and I think it certainly has its challenges around. But on the flip side, it's a lot of what VPaid does, I think, is kind of captured in the IAB VAST 4 specification with normal standardized beaconing, which would enable player vendors or player providers to actually implement some of these viewability heuristics within their own code instead of being dependent on sort of a VPaid executable to try to trigger these heuristics. And I think that would, do well for the industry to move more in that direction, VAST 4 direction, as opposed to the VPaid executables. But people have sort of used VPaid for many years, and they still sort of accustomed to them. And occasionally there are sort of cases where like Truex and the like have done kind of interesting things with VPaid and made them interactive and taken advantage of that. But for the most part, people are just delivering linear video through VPaid, which would be better served through VAST 4 spec.
Okay.
I was just going to say, I started at Turner, I think, 8 years ago, and back then we were saying VAST 4 is going to come and save us. It still hasn't. I'm still waiting. But yeah, that would be ideal, right? Because if you're in a situation where you're trying to do VPaid in the context of SSAI, that gets really sticky, right? Because you're talking about having to sort of cede control from the stream, right, over to essentially a sandbox to execute JavaScript.
Okay.
Right, which can not be easy.
I mean, it's also a nightmare with autoplay, gesture, trigger, pass through, and all sorts of, and then resizing properly, and there's just all sorts of opportunities, and event model consistency. There's just all sorts of opportunities for errors with VPaid.
So let's see if I can sum this up quickly. But listen. So VPaid, the ability to create a bit more interactivity, right? A little bit more control.
Well, can I interject there? I don't want to.
Yeah.
So in the olden days, right,
Right.
with the VPaid 1 spec, right, it was Flash, and it mostly was about interactivity.
Right.
Right? And then as we saw VPaid 2, which was JavaScript based, no one really cares about interactivity that much anymore. It's really all about measurement, right, and viewability and stuff, right? So, for example, a lot of programmatic buyers, right, they're going to have no idea where this thing ultimately runs, and so they want some idea of what happened, some rich metrics or
Right.
data on that. So they're going to embed a lot of that logic in the VPaid too, and that's how they get what they need. So it's sort of transitioned from being an interactivity sort of spec into a spec that helps viewability and measurement.
Sure. And someone said to me last night, VPaid still better CPMs
Sure.
for them. Yeah. But Madison Avenue doesn't know VAST has the same reporting. True?
I'm sorry, it doesn't what?
Madison Avenue doesn't know that VAST has the same reporting capabilities as
Yeah.
VPaid. You can't
You know,
surmise.
if there's anybody out there from Madison Avenue.
Okay. Well,
I mean,
and
that's what I was just saying essentially. Right? Like the newer VAST specifications provide a lot of those heuristics that they were asking for, but they're not. They don't trust them as much as being able to run their own code in that sort of viewability context.
right. Okay. Just making sure we're clear on this. So, and because the VAST and VPaid things, people tend to throw that around because they work in the industry. If you haven't been deep in the industry, it's just another acronym, which you still got to understand. So, let's see. What should we do now? We've got
I think
a
this gentleman had
question.
a question. Do you have a question still, or?
Yeah, question.
Sure.
Live, programmatic. What's the question again?
The question was, are you using the client-side SDK and beaconing to support third-party DMP, ad targeting, or how would you support that in an SSAI environment?
I have to repeat this, so let's see if I get all the points to this. Are they using client-side SDKs within the SSAI
To handle the beacon.
to handle the beaconing?
To support third-party DMP.
To support third-party DMP. Okay, and I will break this out if there's any parts that seem to be getting too bogged down. Okay, who wants to talk to that?
So how I think we've handled it is we make all the calls to get any kind of segments and any kind of information beforehand. So it's like the first thing that gets called before we call for the stream. And then we pass that information as part of the params to the ad server or to the SSAI Stitcher. When they make the call to the ad server, they include those. So it's extra dev work that needs to be done ahead of time to make sure that you're getting that what audience segments and whatnot. Get the params for that. Make sure it gets passed to the SSAI vendor, and that it flows all the way to the ad server to be actioned upon. So that's kind of how we've done it in the past.
Essentially, the ad tag URL macros are evaluated at the client level relative to the SDK that's being run there, and then those get passed through to the ad network.
Okay. Are we okay on that one? It was because it was a multi-part question? Yeah. Well, no, good question. And definitely we want to make sure that we get questions. In fact, we're almost at the point where we should get questions from people. Before we break for questions, is there something else that anybody wants to touch on? I think we've covered a lot to begin with, and I think the questions will just wrap it nicely.
I mean, content conditioning, maybe.
Content conditioning, okay.
Sure.
So, okay, let's quickly go into content conditioning.
Sure. So like you have to think about sort of content conditioning when you're doing server-side ad insertion.
What does content conditioning mean?
So it means like when you have an ad break, you also need kind of a keyframe, or you won't be able to split the content exactly at the point that you want, short of re-encoding that segment, which fewer ad stitching providers support. Like a content plus ad segment. So you have to sort of have tie-in. Ideally, you're working with a broadcasting workflow where the encoder itself is providing the Scuddy tones and the keyframe insertion at the time of which the ad will be displayed, so that it's easier for your packager to split the segment on that boundary. If it's not as fun.
So frame accurate, right?
Right.
Frame accurate.
So if you don't
Scuddy
have that, that means that you're now just subject to whatever keyframe, GOP locations you have within the file, and that maps to what the packager can do around splitting the file for the insertions.
And then what happens if you don't get it right?
You have to re-encode your content.
Well, also, what does the viewer see?
Well, or they will see a slight trimming of the like it'll either come a little bit,
Before or after?
before or after, right? So like you maybe fade to black, and then it starts a little bit of the next segment before it starts the ad, or something like that.
Okay, well, we should touch on Scuddies just before. So Scuddy markers, what are they used for?
So Scuddy markers are in broadcast where it marks where the ad starts are at. It also lets you know when it goes to a provider if you have like the local time. So it's the signaling that happens during the live stream or broadcast. Basically, hey, here's an ad. It's starting now. It's for X amount of time, and that's when it should end.
Okay.
So.
All right. And of course, you need SCUDdy markers.
Yes.
Why?
Well, I mean, otherwise, I guess I'll say this, but you know, in our SCUDdy 35 that's in the manifest for our stream, right, you have a few key pieces of information, right? So one is the asset ID, which you need so you know what you're watching, right? The duration of the ad pod, right, in the case of a live stream. And that way you can make an ad call to the ad server and say, Robert's watching this, and you have 180 seconds to fill.
Okay. All right. Anything else? No. Okay.
I mean, there's way more
Oh, of
you
course
could get
there
into,
is.
but
Of
that's
course
the
there is.
basics,
Of
right?
course.
The most.
I just forgot to talk about SCUDdy. So I wanted to make sure we did. So now let's hit this question again. So it was?
A different question.
Okay, no, that's fine.
So when it comes to understanding whether SSAI is working, what are the health metrics do you look at?
Cool. Okay, so the question is, you guys have to help me out here in case I drop some parts of this. So the metrics for whether SSAI is working, what are they, and what does good look like? Did I get that all? Okay.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to sort of normal QoS KPIs that you hopefully are already tracking to begin with. These are things like, you know, time to first frame, number of rebuffering events, what bit rate was on average consumed, and those sort of metrics. And you kind of have to make sure you keep tabs on that, especially the video start time in the case of VOD, where you're sort of filling a lot of ads up front as opposed to as you arrive at the ad breaks. And also, I guess, the bit rate for which you're serving, if you're not serving ideally you're serving the ads through the same CDN network and they're encoded at the same bit rate so you don't incur additional QoS penalties, KPI negative impact.
So you want the ads to get through without having them look inconsistent?
Well,
Because of the-
well, just like for instance, if your ad configuration for the asset encoding was misconfigured and they're encoding at 7 MBS and your normal 1080p is at 4,
Right.
then all of a sudden your ABR algorithm may get thrown off or result in a buffer underrun or have some sort of QoS impact.
Okay. Anybody else on this?
I mean, it's going to be a lot of the same. You just want to make sure that you're getting all the your discrepancies are low, ads look good, and that's pretty much it.
What's the definition of
The
discrepancy?
discrepancies, just that you're making sure that your first-party impression numbers are matching to any third-party services or like any of the agencies if they have a third-party
Right.
tracker that they're using.
Okay. All right. Other questions here? So let's see how we're doing. Oh, we get lots of time here. And if we don't have a question to start with, I can go someplace else. But anyone? No? Okay. So, okay, when you're talking about personalization and also first and third party, what do people need to know about to make sure that it's working correctly? So you're talking about discrepancies, but what are people doing? They're mapping information?
Well, you're checking the reporting from your ad server. You're checking reporting from the third-party service, but you're also, hopefully, your SSAI provider has some kind of logs or tools that you can actually also confirm that you're seeing all the beacons going out.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think there's a lot more if you're looking at sort of, when you're trying to roll this out or whatever, right? It can be challenging to debug or troubleshoot server-side ad insertion,
Right.
especially as more and more things move to HTTPS. It can get troublesome, right?
Okay.
A lot of the connected devices don't allow you to proxy them with Charles or whatever, and so you're stuck. I mean, the best way to handle this is to hack a router, essentially with DDWRT, like aftermarket firmware,
Okay.
to where you can essentially run all of the traffic through this router and then see the traffic. But that doesn't work for secure traffic, right? So debug builds with all unsecure stuff, right? Which can be troubling. or trouble, hard to get in the middle of a production issue or outage.
Okay, I'll tell you what, how about, to me, probably, I'm guessing that people in the room would want to know kind of like the couple pieces of advice you each would have if you're just getting into this, or if you're switching something, or whatever the use cases you can specifically think of, but say what the use case is. I'll start with Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll play off sort of the concept of debugging and establishing mechanisms to easily, or more easily figure out what's going on. So especially if you control the player runtime, making sure that it has pretty detailed reporting around, like a modern HLS or Dash playback engine, Shaka or the like, can give you quite a bit of media information as it tries to play back the stream. So you can report in like what URI actually failed to load, or additional details that you may be relevant towards debugging the system can be surfaced if you have sort of more control over the playback environment. In terms of other advice around ad insertion, I think don't approach it as a panacea like with all these things. I mean, you can't solve all your problems really easily. Don't have that expectation going into anything, of course. But I think there's trade-offs, right, with anything, and you're just going in with eyes open that you're sort of trading some flexibility and there's disadvantages to the client side and then advantages to the server.
Okay, so you've been setting up your server-side ad insertion, right? So as you started to do this, like, what was the thing that you thought of? I mean, was it the debugging that was what you would focus on, or what you would tell people to do?
Yeah, like it really helped. We were dealing a lot with sort of timing issues around, the ad insertion. Is it perfectly aligned, both in terms of audio within Dash, where you have demuxed streams, and in terms of the presentation time of the content, because we have sort of out-of-band subtitles that need to be synchronized with the video playback, and sort of establishing testing assets that just displayed the frame number and had a beep every second really helped us kind of dive through those problems.
Okay, so that's good for you. Now, what about you guys? So you've been doing this for a while.
Yes.
Okay, so you're an experienced, let's set up your use case, okay? Yeah. You're working at scale.
Well,
big time.
I think part of it is to expand on the debugging aspect of it, is not only working with the SSAI provider on how to debug like whatever tools they provide, but also your internal development teams to make sure that they have easy mechanisms for you to access those tools. Some of the providers require a special debug mode, or passing a debug parameter. Make sure that your internal devs are aware of these types of things that'll help you out, that they can build those tools into your apps, because it'll help the whole process go a lot faster.
Okay, that sounds great. Did you want to say something? We have a question. Yes?
Do you guys have any recommended best practices for optimizing programmatic fill rate in an SSAI environment?
Good question. So optimizing programmatic fill rate in SSAI, best practices, what would they be?
So I think it goes back to your first question, is making sure those ad macros are evaluating properly. Some of the SSAI vendors have the cookie pass-through, which is important for targeting purposes, and but also, of course, make sure they're GDPR and CCPA compliant, as that's a thing now. But making sure that you have mechanisms to pass through those relative. If the data is not there, obviously they can't do appropriate targeting and can't do appropriate maximization of monetization for programmatic fill.
I would also say, too, one thing that can help, sometimes if you blast a particular programmatic vendor with 1 million requests within the same second, you may not get a fantastic fill rate across all 1 million of those people. Some stitching vendors have the ability to sort of like space that out in advance, right? And sort of make calls in advance of the actual ad break occurring. And that can be really helpful when you're dealing with this kind of stuff at scale.
Okay, Robert, what about, let's set your use case up. So multi-platforms. How many platforms, just give or take, are you supporting?
I don't know, 10, 12, something like that.
Okay,
I would have,
10.
if I thought about it, I could count them out.
Okay, 10. So you're supporting 10 or 12 platforms, right? And then how many different properties across that? Just
Probably another 10. Yeah.
okay. So we have a lot of numbers here, right?
Yes.
So what would be the recommendations or the advice you would hand out for somebody who might be in your same situation?
Yeah. I guess the biggest thing, yeah, would be to try to keep your solution as try to keep it to where you are able to roll things out cross-platform. I would highly recommend using SSAI for that. The less fragmentation you have between your brands and the different platforms that you have to support, the easier it is going to be for you to maintain and for your own internal teams to scale. I mean, this is something that I'm sure you guys have the same issue too, right? Where every brand thinks that they're special and wants to do things a particular way. But the more that sort of drives the solution of your technology, the more fragmentation you have, the harder it is for your client teams to maintain.
So consistency, standards, really important.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Okay. I think we might have time for one or two more questions. Does anybody else have one? Okay. No questions. So, oh, yes. One question. Yes. For the panel. Okay. So the question was, which vendors are you using? Am I allowed to ask you guys that? I don't know.
I mean, it's not rocket science to figure out who we use.
There's
I
a
mean,
few
if you-
vendors, right?
Well, I mean,
The press
if you,
releases.
yeah, I mean, it's not like there's 100 different people that do this, and then
Okay.
on top of that, anybody with a device and Charles Proxy could likely figure out what we're doing. So
Right.
I don't know what's appropriate, but
Well, I don't want to get these guys in trouble because I want to keep doing this panel over and over again until we replace it with something else. Are there any other questions that we could easily answer that are in the room? So we talked about international. Somebody asked about that, and let's see how much time we got. We got a couple minutes here. So the question about international, could you rephrase it again for me, just so I make sure I hit the accurate?
Thought process on strategy and best practices, international marketplace versus the U.S.
Okay. So best practices, strategy. Are any of you guys delivering international?
Coming down the pipe that we need to be aware of.
Right. Okay. So internationally, are you guys
I
delivering?
mean, Crunchyroll is has a major international presence for AVOD,
Okay. And so.
and so we will be launching internationally. We haven't, whether obviously getting the ad stitching service close to the users is of critical importance. The latency involved with filling an ad and getting back that manifest, is already long time, is already impactful relative to the time to first frame for filling the quantity of ads in the best case scenario. So certainly you don't want to add additional latency of having the user reach out to a SSAI service that is outside of their local geography.
So you need delivery within.
Yeah, so obviously, all of these SSAI providers run in the cloud, and so you certainly want them minimally regionalized, ideally serverless or edge compute.
Okay. Good point. Anyone else here doing international?
Not I.
we're all sort of geo-fenced in the U.S., right? I mean,
Okay.
a lot of our content is driven by TVE, right? Which by its nature will be mostly domestic U.S.
Okay.
And then, with other stuff like sports properties that aren't necessarily TV, we only have domestic rights. It's not
Right.
international stuff. I mean, from a technology standpoint, though, I don't know how much it really matters as long as you're taking into account, international sort of privacy regulations and stuff,
Okay.
right? I mean, so obviously, if you're doing something in Europe, you would want to make sure that you have the ability to support GDPR and do everything that you need to. But I don't know. I'm not aware personally of any other sort of like different ad types or technologies that are being sort of thrust upon us from international.
I do know that there's higher usage of ad blockers in some parts of the world, which potentially SSAI would help.
Okay. All right. So we talked a lot about the different parts of this AI. I I tried to kind of cover as much of the categories that I think that you needed to know about, and I'm hoping that this has at least answered some of your questions. In fact, let's poll the audience. So, do you guys feel like you actually have enough of a grounding that you know more now than when you first entered the room? If you want to raise your hand, let's see. Okay, yeah, but so for those of you who did not raise your hands, is there something specific that you want to know about that we haven't covered? Let's check in. Okay, so we have actually covered everything. And whenever I ask these polls, sometimes I know people don't want to answer, but just like how we won't necessarily talk specifics about each vendors, these guys will be here for a few minutes if you have some questions. There probably is a panel in this room. Actually, there isn't. There's a coffee break. So these guys can answer a couple questions, and then coffee will be in the show floor, and you can go and take a little break, take a little walk around, and get yourself ready for the sessions later on. So I want to thank you guys,
Well, thank you.
and we'll do it again. All right,
Sounds good.
cool. Thanks very much.